The new chief technology officer didn't just arrive at Lakehurst Financial Systems, he crash landed. Picture a discount airline coming in too fast on a windy day. Paper's flying coffee machine shattered everyone slightly queasy from the turbulence. Within his first week in the Dallas headquarters, Garrett Lang, 41, and fresh off a flashy stint at a West Coast fintech, had stamped the words Transformation Initiative on a dozen PowerPoint decks and started referring to himself as a disruptive change agent. His kind of change didn't mean repairing what was broken, it meant gutting anything older than his Apple Watch. The first real collision came on a Monday morning in late March 2022. The entire development group was crammed into the glass-walled conference room, the one that made you feel like you were in an aquarium, while the rest of the office walked by. Garrett plugged in his sleek laptop, gave the room a salesman's grin, and began slicing through our quarterly performance metrics like a game show host revealing bad news with a smile. When he got to my section, the stability metrics for the platform's core transaction APIs, he didn't even try to interpret the charts. He leaned back, tapped the screen with his stylus, and smirked. "This," he said, "is like a museum exhibit for repressed engineers. We're going to drag this dinosaur into the modern age." A few awkward chuckles flickered in the room, thin and quick. No one made eye contact with me. I kept my hands steepled, face impassive, letting him enjoy the sound of his own voice. In my mind, I saw it, the plain text README file sitting deep in the repository, the one Garrett had never opened. If he had, he would have known why mocking me was the most expensive hobby he could pick up. I'd met his kind before, all presentation, no perception. Men like Garrett think systems run on fresh ideas and buzzwords. In reality, they run on after-hours vendor calls, handshake renewal deals sealed over lukewarm hotel coffee, and quiet bug fixes that never make it into Jira. Garrett didn't know the names of the vendor reps who took my calls at 11:00 p.m., or that they answered for me, not for Lakehurst. He breezed on, throwing out terms like sunsetting legacy architecture and full cloud-native migration like magic spells. Across the table, a few senior engineers gave me cautious side glances. They'd been around long enough to recognize the metallic sound of someone tightening the bolts on their own guillotine. Garrett wrapped up with a flourish, promising agile innovation sprints and a total architecture refresh before the next quarter. I sipped my black coffee, slowly feeling the weight of what I wasn't saying. He thought he was here to modernize Lakehurst. In truth, he was about to burn down his own foundation, and all I had to do was stand back and let him strike the match. The whispers started before the paperwork did. Meetings about strategic priorities suddenly happened without me. Slack threads went silent the moment I typed. Hallway chats ended with a polite nod and a closed door. Garrett was making his pitch to the executives, peddling his favorite line that the company's growth was being strangled by outdated architecture. And in his mind, I was the embodiment of that architecture. In Garrett Lang's mind, I wasn't just a senior systems engineer, I was the breathing, coffee-drinking embodiment of the outdated architecture he was determined to erase. By the second month of his tenure at Lakehurst Financial Systems, he'd stopped pretending to consult me at all. Emergency innovation stand-ups were called without so much as a calendar invite my way. Updates were pushed to systems I'd kept stable for 12 years as though I'd already been erased from the org chart. I didn't fight it. Every flashy, unnecessary change he rolled out was another loose thread in a sweater that had held the company together for decades. All I had to do was stand back and let him keep tugging. The break came on a brisk Monday morning in May 2022. HR called me into their beige-walled office, the one that smelled faintly of copier toner and stale air. The director didn't bother with pleasantries. She slid a manila folder across the table like it was a diner check. "We've decided to move in a new direction," she said, in that flat teleprompter cadence of someone who's practiced sounding sympathetic without feeling it. "Your role is no longer aligned with our innovation goals. No offer to transition my responsibilities. No request for knowledge transfer. Just a cold, clean cut." Garrett didn't even have the nerve to show up. For a moment, I half expected to see him leaning in the doorway, smirk in place, ready to lob one last parting quip. But he was probably upstairs, too busy driving transformation to realize he was standing on the ignition point of his own implosion. I glanced at the severance packet, nodded once, and signed without hesitation. No questions, no protests. That seemed to throw the HR director off balance. Maybe she'd expected me to bargain, plead, or flare up. But I felt none of that. Just the deep satisfaction of knowing they had yanked out the keystone without realizing the arch was about to collapse. Back at my desk, I packed methodically the framed photo of my daughter at her college graduation, a favorite ceramic coffee mug, a couple of thumb drives. No dramatic scene, no goodbyes. That would turn into gossip. A few of the older engineers passed by, eyes flicking between me and Garrett's glass-walled office. They didn't speak, but their small, deliberate nods said enough. They knew. I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with the one thing they didn't understand they'd already lost. Before heading out, I opened my terminal one last time, not to change anything, just to watch the dashboard. Every API was green, every service running clean. It was as if the system knew it was about to be orphaned. I considered dropping a farewell note into the company Slack, but decided against it. Let them find out the hard way. The moment HR updated my status to former employee, the licenses I held would begin their silent countdown. Not instantly, that would be too obvious. They'd fail in sequence days apart, just enough time for Garrett Lang to hang himself in front of everyone. I stepped into the bright Dallas morning without looking back. I didn't need to look back at the Lakehurst building. Somewhere inside, the silent countdown had already started, and there was nothing Garrett Lang or anyone else could do to stop it. Not now. Not without me. If you're ready to see what happens when the next corporate ego walks straight into their own downfall, tap subscribe. Now you won't want to miss the next chapter. It kicked off sooner than I thought. Just 48 hours after HR slid that manila folder across the table, the first API went dark. Not a graceful taper, not a polite warning email, just a sudden, clinical, hard fail. It was the kind of outage that froze transactions midstream and left customers staring at that dreaded spinning wheel of death. From what I heard later, the first 30 minutes were pure chaos. Junior devs scoured the logs thinking it was a network hiccup. A couple tried restarts. Others ran trace routes like they were chasing a phantom. Nothing worked. The connection wasn't just broken. It was gone. By noon, the panic had climbed the chain. Garrett strolled into the engineering bay wearing that trademark "trust me" smile, brushing it off as a minor hiccup. He urged everyone to keep their eyes on the bigger picture, as if losing one of our most critical integrations with a top-tier vendor was no more serious than a jammed printer. I imagine more than one of the older engineers wanted to strangle him on the spot. I wasn't there to see it, though. I was at home sitting on the back porch of my small craftsman bungalow in Oak Cliff, sipping coffee and watching the early May light shift across the garden. My phone buzzed. A text from Samir, one of my old teammates. API G1 just dropped. No failover. He's calling it a glitch. This is bad. I didn't reply. Those licenses weren't plug and play. You couldn't just spin up a new one like a cloud instance. Renewals happened through vendor reps I'd known for years, people who took my calls at midnight, who'd bypass queues because we'd solved each other's problems over stale conference coffee. Garrett didn't know their names. He didn't even know they existed. And there was no universe in which they'd answer his Friday night voicemail. Back at the office, the cracks were widening. Without that API key, client-facing features were dead in the water. Support lines lit up. Ticket queues swelled. The sales team was cornering engineering managers for answers they couldn't give. And Garrett. He spun it as a live stress test for system resilience. Sure, if you define resilience as a slow-motion car wreck. I didn't feel vindicated yet. This was just the first ripple. The real wave was already inbound. The next expiration was queued and timed, built right into the contracts themselves. Less than 24 hours later, another service would drop. Then another. Out on my porch, I could almost hear it, the soft, inevitable click of the next domino tipping forward, gravity doing the rest. They had staked Lakehurst's future on a system they didn't understand and fired the only person who could actually explain it. Somewhere up on the 15th floor behind those tinted glass walls, I pictured Garrett Lang leaning back in his chair, still spinning his transformation pitch to the board. He'd be smiling, talking about agility and modernization, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath him was already starting to buckle. And me, I just sat on my back porch with my coffee, letting the silence do its work. By the end of the weekend, hairline cracks had turned into yawning sinkholes. The second API collapsed late Saturday morning, a clean sever, no errors, no recovery script. That one fed directly into the internal reporting system for half the finance department. In a heartbeat, invoicing froze. Transaction reconciliation stopped mid-process. Client-facing dashboards turned into blank slates. I could picture the finance floor like a frozen lake, people staring at monitors, fingers hovering over keyboards, the first ripple of panic settling into their shoulders when they realized this wasn't a blip. Then, on Sunday evening, the third API dropped. That one wasn't just an internal artery, it was one of our most visible client integrations. By Monday morning, the support queue had turned into a battlefield. Account managers were bypassing the help desk entirely, answering calls from high-value clients who weren't just angry, they were openly threatening penalties and murmuring about contract terminations. Garrett, from what I heard, had lost his easy swagger. The grinning soundbites about resilience and stress tests were gone. In their place, closed-door meetings and clipped Slack messages timestamped at 2:00 a.m. His first move was to blame vendor outages, but that didn't survive long. Too many APIs had failed, too many different vendors, and every failure was the same precise surgical, like someone had flipped a switch by hand. That's when the CTO stepped in. He'd stayed quiet through most of Garrett's grandstanding, but when he moved, people noticed. On Tuesday morning, he walked into the engineering bay and said just one thing: audit the repository. All of it. Then he turned and walked out. The air shifted. I could see it in my head: engineers pulling up modules they hadn't dared to touch since I was still on payroll. Some probably hadn't opened those files in years. And then they'd see it buried deep in the structure, a simple folder labeled README, untouched, waiting. I didn't gloat, at least not out loud. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a certain satisfaction in knowing I was now the unseen center of their storm. My name wasn't yet spoken in those tense meetings, but I was everywhere, in every unanswered question, every dead-end renewal search, every half-remembered conversation about how things used to get done. Out in the world, I kept my rhythm: morning coffee at the kitchen counter, a walk through Kid Springs Park, a quick grocery run down at the Oak Cliff Market. But every so often I'd catch myself smiling at nothing, picturing Garrett Lang's growing desperation. He thought walking me out was clearing the way for innovation. In reality, he'd just yanked out the load-bearing beam and kept building on air. The cascade was far from over. Those contracts weren't random, they were timed like a row of dominoes. Each one was set to expire, just far enough apart to keep them scrambling without a moment to breathe. By the time the fourth and fifth APIs blinked out, the board would be asking pointed questions, and the CTO would be holding that folder, the one proving their so-called museum exhibit was the only thing keeping Lakehurst's architecture upright. They wanted modern. They were about to get a live case study in what happens when you rip out history without reading the manual. By midweek, what began as a quick audit had turned into a full-scale code excavation. Engineers who'd never so much as peeked into the core modules were now combing through them like archaeologists, brushing dust off artifacts, hoping to unearth something that would save them. And in a way, they did. Late Wednesday night, one of the senior developers, a guy who'd been at Lakehurst almost as long as I, had stumbled across a directory buried so deep it might as well have been in another geological stratum. Inside was a folder labeled simply README, not Read me. TXT like a rookie would name it, but plain deliberate, impossible to mistake for an afterthought. He opened it. What he found probably looked like setup instructions to the untrained eye, but anyone who actually read it would realize it was my quiet magnum opus. No drama, no passive-aggressive comments, just clean, methodical documentation. Each core API license, the vendor name, the exact contractual terms. And in every single case, the clause stating that the license was tied to my continued employment, not the company, not the department, me by name, complete with signature dates and renewal schedules. It spelled out in crisp, unambiguous language the chain reaction triggered by my departure licenses, expiring sequentially starting 48 hours after termination, continuing until every dependent service lapsed. I even included renewal instructions, personal contacts, escalation paths, handshake agreements that had kept things alive for over a decade. But without me, those were dead numbers and dead ends. The devs passed the file around like contraband. Some were impressed. Others were terrified. The CTO read it in silence, eyes scanning each paragraph, his jaw tightening with every line. He knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't negligence. This was a structural truth baked into the DNA of the system one Garrett had bulldozed past in his rush to look visionary. Meanwhile, I sat at home, a glass of red wine in hand, scrolling through a novel on my tablet. My phone buzzed with a short text from Samir, one of the few engineers I still trusted. They found it. No explanation. None needed. I knew exactly what it was. I could picture the scene in my head, Garrett Lang sitting in his glass-walled office posture, still cocky at first, while the CTO walked in, holding a printed copy of my README. I could almost see the exact moment his smirk faltered, the shift from smug dismissal to the cold realization that there was no quick fix, no substitute, no one he could dump this problem on. The truth was simple and inescapable. Garrett had cut loose the only person holding the keys to his $50 million operational backbone, and the gates were now closing. That document wasn't a threat. It wasn't some clever trap. It was just the facts. Facts he had chosen not to learn, laid out in the calm, methodical tone of someone who had done the work, documented it completely, and walked away, knowing time itself would prove its value. As I sat in my kitchen listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, it sank in. Not glee, not even revenge. Just the deep, bone-level satisfaction of foresight paying off exactly the way I'd known it would. By Thursday morning, the CEO's patience had burned away. He wasn't a man who tolerated surprises. Now his inbox was stacked with client escalation emails, breach of service notices, and a few legal threats worded just politely enough to be admissible in court. The board had already called him twice before 9:00 a.m., each time delivering the same unspoken ultimatum: fix this, or start polishing your resume. So he did what CEOs do when the smoke gets too thick. He called an emergency meeting. Not a casual swing by my office talk. This was the kind where the glass walls fog with tension and every chair is filled by someone whose career might not survive the hour. From what I heard later, he came in hard. Garrett was already seated, pale and clammy, trying to look like he still had control of the situation. The CTO sat across from him, stone-faced, my printed README on the table between them like a smoking gun. The CEO didn't waste time. He pointed at the stack of pages. "Is this true?" His voice was low but sharp enough to slice through the room. Garrett mumbled something about legacy dependencies and unforeseen contractual nuances, but the CEO wasn't buying it. He turned to the CTO, who simply nodded once. That was enough. The air shifted. "Get her on the phone," the CEO ordered. Garrett reached for his cell, but the CTO stopped him, sliding the phone across the table toward the CEO. "She's not going to answer you." That was the moment the real power shift landed, when they finally realized I wasn't just a missing piece in their puzzle. I was the only piece. And they were right. I didn't answer. The first call came mid-morning. I let the first call ring out while I folded a fresh load of laundry. The second came an hour later, just as I was slicing bell peppers for lunch. The third, from a blocked number, buzzed halfway through a chapter of the mystery novel I'd been saving for months. Each time I let it go to voicemail. Not because I was being coy, but because I wanted them to feel it. The silence, the waiting, the helplessness. By the fourth attempt, a text appeared from the CEO himself. We need to speak. Urgent. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just raw urgency. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and went back to cooking. Somewhere in that 15th floor conference room, I knew Garrett and the rest were pacing, arguing, watching more systems fall apart while their vendor emails went unanswered. Every hour they waited for my reply was another hour of chaos, contracts, unraveling clients, walking revenue projections bleeding out in real time. And all I had to do was nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send a threat. I simply let the clock keep ticking. By the end of the day, the CEO had left 2 more voicemails, each one tighter, more frayed than the last. Garrett Lang, once the embodiment of swagger, was now a man crouching under the shadow of his own undoing. Control wasn't something I had to fight for. It had already rolled back to me the moment they realized they couldn't move forward without my say-so. I hadn't lifted a finger yet. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that by nightfall it wasn't me waiting on their decision. It was them waiting on mine. When I finally returned the CEO's call, it wasn't because I'd run out of errands, it was because the timing suited me. His voice was tight, the kind that comes from someone straining to hold authority while standing ankle-deep in desperation. He didn't waste breath on pleasantries. "We need you at the all-hands tomorrow," he said. "Not would you be willing? Not can we talk terms, just a flat directive." I let the pause stretch. "Why?" "Because there are things the company needs to hear," he replied, and I could almost hear Garrett breathing in the background. "From you." I agreed, but only with the quiet satisfaction of knowing this wasn't reconciliation. This was theater. The CEO wasn't trying to mend fences. He was setting the stage for a controlled detonation. And I was the fuse. The next morning, I walked into the main hall with the kind of calm that unsettles people. The open floor was crammed, rows of folding chairs fanning out from the stage, the big projection screen glowing white behind it. Conversations buzzed low, but the air was taut. Everyone knew something was about to break. Garrett was already on stage, fiddling with his laptop. His smile was just a little too taut, his hands moving quicker than they needed to. He looked like a man told to step into a lion's den wearing a ribeye around his neck. His usual arm-sweeping, buzzword-spewing bravado gone. Garrett stood there with a brittle stiffness, like every muscle in his body was bracing for impact. The CEO stepped up beside him, scanning the crowded room until his gaze landed on me. There was no warmth in that look, just the silent acknowledgement of 2 generals on opposite sides who both understood exactly how this battle would end. He reached for a thick sheaf of paper from the podium. Even from the back of the hall, I recognized it instantly, my README printed in its entirety, pages clipped neatly together. The room hushed. Folding chairs creaked as people leaned forward. The only sound was the faint, steady hum of the projector overhead. "Before we begin," the CEO said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the room, "I'd like our Chief Technology Officer to share something with the team, something we all need to understand about our systems." Without ceremony, he handed Garrett the stack of pages. For a beat too long, Garrett didn't move. He just stared down at them, like if he waited long enough they might vanish. Then, with mechanical precision, he took them in both hands. From where I stood, I could see the sheen of sweat at his hairline, the way his jaw flexed like he was grinding glass between his teeth. Every single person in that room, from the interns in the last row to the directors in the front, could feel it, that electric, skin-prickling anticipation before something drops. Everyone knew it wouldn't be pretty. And me? I folded my arms, leaned against the wall, and waited for detonation. Garrett began reading in that clipped, careful tone people use when they're fighting to keep their voice steady. The first few lines were tame enough API descriptions, vendor IDs, license renewal intervals. Then he hit the first clause, the one tying a mission-critical API license directly to my name, my continued employment, and my signature on the original contracts. A ripple passed through the room, chairs shifting, quiet throats, clearing heads turning. The implications were sinking in. He kept reading. The second license? The third. Each one bound the same way. Each one already expired or ticking down. Every sentence was another blow he had to deliver to himself in public with no way to soften it. By the middle pages, the color had drained from his face completely. Now he was sweating in earnest, gripping the papers like a lifeline. The more he read, the more unavoidable the truth became. This wasn't some odd legacy quirk or a minor oversight. This was the backbone of Lakehurst's business, and he had snapped it clean in two by forcing me out. The CTO sat off to the side, arms folded, his stare fixed on Garrett with the cold, knowing look of someone who had warned the driver there was a cliff ahead. The CEO didn't move, his expression unreadable, letting Garrett twist in his own noose. Paragraph by paragraph, my calm professional prose laid out the disaster in plain English. No malice, no threats. Just the unvarnished reality Garrett had refused to learn before making the biggest mistake of his career. The renewal contacts he didn't have, the vendor relationships he'd unknowingly severed, the precise timelines for each API's automatic shutdown, all already in motion. By the time he reached the final paragraph, his voice had thinned to a tremor. The words were simple, clinical. In the event of my departure from Lakehurst Financial Systems, all licenses herein will lapse according to the timeline specified above. Continuity of service requires my active employment status. He froze for a moment, as if not speaking the line might keep it from being real. But the CEO gave a slow, deliberate nod, and Garrett forced the words out. When he finished, the silence was absolute. No coughing, no whispering, just the low hum of the HVAC and the collective weight of 100 people processing what they had just heard. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I simply met his eyes across the room for a heartbeat, letting him see that I knew exactly what this meant. And then I looked away. The damage was already done. No public apology, no emergency hire, no flurry of vendor calls could reverse what had unraveled over the last week. Garrett had marched me out thinking he was clearing the path for progress. Instead, he had dismantled his own foundation brick by brick in front of the only audience that mattered. And now, there was no putting it back together. The CEO dismissed the meeting with a clipped "that's all," and I turned toward the exit. Behind me, Garrett was still clutching the stack of papers, hands trembling, looking like a man who had just realized the museum exhibit he mocked was the only structure keeping the walls from caving in. I walked out through the parted rows of chairs, the murmur starting up again in my wake. No gloating, no victory speech. Just the calm satisfaction of knowing the truth had landed exactly where it needed to. The hallway outside felt cooler, lighter, like I'd just stepped out of a pressure chamber. By the time I hit the glass doors to the lobby, my pace had already settled into something easy, unhurried. Somewhere upstairs, Garrett would be replaying the moment in his head, wishing he could undo it. But the beauty of structural truths is that once revealed, they can't be buried again. I pushed open the doors to the warm May air, letting the sunlight spill across my face. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. I'd love to hear what you think. Was I right to let Garrett's innovation crash under its own weight? Or should I have stepped in sooner? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. And if you've ever had a boss dismiss your work without understanding its value, share your story so others know they're not alone. My advice: document everything, protect your leverage, and never let arrogance rush you into action. Sometimes the quietest moves echo the loudest. Support the channel so we can keep these stories and lessons alive.